Here we are, Hebrews chapter 8 today. We are talking about, in this chapter, what's called Jesus's session in heaven. That's what theologians would call it. It just answers the question, what's Jesus doing right now? As I said, sometimes the book of Hebrews is difficult to read because we don't know our Old Testament very well. And the writer is referring to the Old Testament a lot and making parallels and analogies and drawing similarities between various characters and offices in the Old Testament and Jesus himself. So to help us out here, let me give you the point. That's how the chapter starts today, chapter 8. He says, now the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest. So let me sum up the chapter for you as the writer does here. Jesus is the new and, I can't read my own writing here. He is the new and eternal high priest bringing a new and better and eternal covenant. That's the message of this passage here. That's the message of this chapter. So let's just start there. Jesus is the new eternal high priest bringing a new and better covenant, eternal covenant. And let's just look at this closely here. First, we see Jesus in heaven in verses 1 through 4. Note that he's seated at the right hand of God. We're going to develop this idea later in the book of Hebrews, but this seated means that he has completed his work and that he is waiting. Now, in the Old Testament, the high priests and the other priests were constantly busy. They were constantly offering bulls and goats and pigeons and doves and grain offerings all the time. It was continuous. It would only stop if the people stopped sinning. So you know it was continuous. Jesus, however, is seated, it says in verse 1. And it says he's at the right hand of God. He's in this privileged position. Not, I'll point out, on the throne of David at this point. When Jesus reigns on earth, he'll reign from the throne of David. But Jesus is in heaven. He's seated at the right hand of God. He's sharing God's throne. And he's a minister there in the heavenly tabernacle, heavenly places. That's where he is ministering. Right now, Jesus is in heaven in a physical body, just as physical as you and I. He's there at the right hand of God, and he's ministering in the heavenly tabernacle. And he's appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. The writer's going to not talk about these gifts and sacrifices until the next chapter, actually. He's going to talk about something else. So keep that in mind, that Jesus has something to offer, as all priests must. But since he's sitting at God's right hand, that offering was once for all. Now the scene shifts from the heavenly temple and to the earth. And we see a different and fading order of Levitical priests at work on the earth. It's interesting as I read this section because I think that what we see here is evidence that the letter to the Hebrews was written while there were still temple sacrifices going on. There was still temple ministry happening. It says they're serving a shadow or a copy of the real thing in heaven. So we have Jesus in heaven, seated at God's right hand at the true tabernacle. And we have these, and he's a Melchizedek type of priest, eternal, superior to Abraham, superior to the Levites. Here we have the Levitical priests on earth, inferior, ministering at a temple that's a mere shadow or a copy of the one that's in heaven that Christ is at. It says Christ's ministry, therefore, is more excellent than theirs. Theirs is a Mosaic covenant ministry, an old covenant ministry. Jesus' ministry is after the manner of a new covenant. And then he begins to quote in verse 8, he quotes Jeremiah 31 through 33, which is the new covenant. So in the Old Testament, you have covenants that God has made with Israel. The basic covenant was the covenant with Abraham, called the Abrahamic covenant. And we see that in Genesis chapter 12, and it's elaborated on in Genesis 15 and 17 and 22. We have a land covenant that's made by the Lord in Deuteronomy chapter 30. It expands some features of the Abrahamic covenant and gives Israel the guarantee that they'll be drawn back into the land and they'll possess the land that God has promised to them. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we have a covenant with David, the Davidic covenant, to have an eternal king on the Davidic throne, also expanding on a certain aspect of the Mosaic or the Abrahamic covenant. And then finally, we have the new covenant in Jeremiah 31, which is quoted here. Notice I skipped the Mosaic covenant. Well, the Abrahamic, the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant are unconditional and eternal covenants from the Lord. The Mosaic covenant is conditional and temporary. It's going to be replaced by the covenant of Jeremiah 31 called the New Covenant. And that's what is being talked about here. And notice in verses 8 through 10, it's specifically made with Israel. It's made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It says that the old covenant is obsolete and ready to vanish. So this is, again, interesting here. It's important to read the Bible closely. It's not saying that the covenant has come to an end at this point, but it's saying that the old covenant is obsolete and ready to vanish. So that old covenant that the priests and the Levites are administering in Jerusalem in that copy of the heavenly temple, that has got a shelf life. It's about to end. And it's about to be replaced. And it has not vanished yet, but it's ready to vanish. We'll see this again in chapter 9, verse 9, where it talks about the part of the temple being symbolic of the present age. That is, it's still standing, it's still going on, it continues. What it's saying here, though, is that Jesus has now ratified this new covenant. In my view, and when we get to chapter 10, I'll talk about the different views of the new covenant. But in my view of the new covenant is that it's a covenant that's made exclusively with Israel. That covenant was ratified by Jesus' blood at his crucifixion, and that it will be inaugurated at Jesus' second coming. Similar to in the United States how we elect a president. The president's first elected in November, ratified January 6th this year, and then inaugurated on January 20th. So Jesus has been ratified. He's ratified the new covenant. The new covenant has not yet begun yet. So Jesus is the ratification. And the question again is, it came up in the last chapter, the application here is, are you going to be found trying to please God in an approach that's been replaced and is about to vanish? Or are you going to pursue Christ, pursue that perfect priest, that eternal priest with a better and new covenant that he's brought? The answer is obvious, brothers and sisters. The answer is we need to pursue Christ and not give up, not fade away, not neglect him, not drift, but we need to be diligent in our pursuit of him every day in his word, every day in prayer, every day in fellowship with God's people. God bless you, brothers and sisters, and God bless your study in the book of Hebrews. And I pray that the Holy Spirit is using up the words of the book of Hebrews to stir you up and encourage you to continue in the Lord.